Well, for anyone who I haven't met yet, I'm Kara, and I'm helping teach this session as well. Heather stepped in to help with the kids today because Ken is sick, so she's back there. But so I get the pleasure of being with you guys and teaching today. Let's start out with a question at our tables. The question this week is, what did you want to be when you grew up? Like as a kid, what did you want to be when you grew up? Discuss at the table. We all kind of we don't all end up where we didn't expect, but I wanted to be a figure skater growing up. Yes. And I know, that's why I really like that book. We had a pond at my house growing up, and my dad was a hockey player, and so he would make a rink and he would go out with the hose and make it smooth, and he had sideboards and stuff. So my dad and my brothers would play hockey, and I had to wear the hand-me-down hockey skates from my brothers. So I never had a toe pick, and I made up a dance to the Pocahontas soundtrack. My mom was my only audience. I didn't make it very far. But yeah, it's... Well, that's true. That's true. Because she would totally do that. Well, that will tie back in a little while with the lesson. But we're going to start then. We're actually going to make it to Genesis 2 today. I feel like we've been really slowly dipping our toes into Genesis and hanging out in Genesis 1. But we're going to still backtrack and finish a little bit of the end of chapter 1. So open your Bibles to Genesis 1 and your workbooks to page 56. And I talk about Jen Wilkin as though we're buddies, even though I don't know her. So I'll be like, well, Jen had us do this, so we'll just all be on a first-name basis with Jen today. So she had us mark in the text, every occurrence of the word image and likeness in green. How many did you guys come up with? 4? Yep. My version had 4 as well. Everyone get 4? So the text says, verses 26 and 27, then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heaven, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. So thinking back over last week's lesson, what else was made in the image of God? Thinking back over last week's lesson, what else was made in the image of God? No. Nothing. I was trying to trick you. So no other parts of creation were made in God's image. Humans are the only ones that he stamped his Imago Dei on. What does it mean, though, to be created in the image of God? I think that's question 2. And how do humans uniquely reflect the image of God? What'd you guys write down? Yeah, that's great. She said, if you couldn't hear her, that we're not like God physically because God is spirit, even though we do have spirit, but different from animals in that we mentally can understand more, we're not as instinctual, and we're more relational. That's great. Did anybody have anything else to add? Yes. Yes. It's God has what they call communicable attributes and non-communicable or incommunicable? Incommunicable attributes. So you think of I always think of an illness. If it's a communicable disease, it can spread. That's not the same, but that's how I remember it. But his communicable attributes are those ones that we can reflect, there's things that, like love and compassion and even holiness, to be set apart. Now, we don't achieve them to the same level, or we don't possess them to the same level as God, because he does them all perfectly. And then there's the incommunicable attributes like omnipotence and omniscience and eternality, all of those things that we can't reflect because we aren't God. We can't do those things. But you're right, we reflect his attributes to the world. Anybody have anything else? Any other thoughts? A soul. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, sometimes I think my dogs do. But you're right, we have a soul. To be created in God's image means to reflect him to the world. We talked about that with his attributes. That we should be striving to interact with the world in the way that God would interact with the world, with creation and with humans. And like Amy said, physically, we're not reflecting him physically because God doesn't have a body, but we can reflect him mentally because we have the ability to process and reason and be rational and that sort of thing, ability to make choices. We reflect him morally. We're created to be righteous and holy and set apart. And socially, Amy touched on that one too. We're made for community with one another. And that reflects God because he lives in perfect harmony and perfect community within the Trinity. And so we can reflect him socially as well. Another important aspect is that because all humans are created in the image of God, we are innately, inherently valuable. God speaks it. He bestows dignity on his creation the moment he creates us. So our worth and our dignity and our value, it's woven into our very being. No one else gets to decide that. So we're all valuable based regardless of race, gender, physical attributes, intelligence, any other thing that the world could mark as less than. They don't get to do that. God already marked us as valuable because we're created in his image. We're precious to him and we have value. And every human has value. This is why Christians are pro-life, because he values life. Because they're created in his image. Now, not all image bearers are reflecting God well. They might be not believers. They're living ways contrary to how God would call us to live. But regardless, even so, they are still made in God's image, whether they're reflecting that image back to the world or not. And then verse 27 says, male and female, he created them. God lovingly created two genders, and he assigns that gender to each human. It's crazy that we live in a time where this is called into question. It shouldn't be like radical for me to say this. But it's clear in the Bible that gender is not a social construct. Gender is created by God when he creates humans. In Genesis 1:1, 2 weeks ago, we talked about in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So God created everything. Last week, we looked at everything in between, earth, heaven, animals, plants, everything. As he creates them, he immediately and effortlessly knows everything about everyone and everything for all time. And this is that omniscience that I mentioned earlier. He knows everything. He created it. He gets to decide how everything is meant, like what everything's purpose is and how everything is meant to be. So because God designed humans, he designed them male and female, God gets to define what gender looks like, how humans were meant to be made. It's not up to us as a society to decide, or as a person to decide what we prefer our gender to be. God designs it, so God defines it. And the Bible is clear on that. Yes, exactly. God doesn't have a specific gender. Both genders are uniquely reflect him in different ways. He has assigned different, we're going to talk about this more in the second half, but yes, you need man and woman to fully reflect God's character and God's uniqueness. My next thing I was going to say was that man and women are equal image bearers. One's not better than the other or more or less. God created them male and female. And we'll talk about that more after the break today. Could I get a volunteer then to read verses 28 through 31? Thank you. So this section is what theologians refer to as the cultural mandate or the creation mandate. This is what what their role was within creation. The command to be fruitful and multiply according to God's intended design, which would be like heterosexual relationship. That man had authority, dominion over the rest of creation, and that man was to responsibly use the resources that he had the authority over. Dominion means to rule over, and the word subdue here, it's not like a violent thing. It means to bring under cultivation. So it's not a violent thing. And this is part of God's blessing to mankind, to be able to, created in his image, use these vast resources for his glory and for their use as well. And like them, we're the caretakers of earth still. Humans have dominion over creation. And just like I said, we're to reflect God's image to the world and try to interact with other humans the way that he would, by showing, acknowledging their value and treating them with dignity. With creation, we're also responsible to steward his creation well. And she asked, our friend Jen, asked on page 57, number 8, bearing in mind that God pronounces the creation good, how were humans intended to be good rulers over all the creatures of the earth? What are the qualities of a good ruler? So talking about man having dominion over the plants and the animals, what would the qualities of a good ruler look like for them, or practically, what does that look like for us today? Yeah. With how we care for the animals and plants. Mm-hmm. Yep. What else? Mm-hmm. Loving and compassionate. I think of not being wasteful with the things we have, the resources like water, different plants, food, things like that, just how we are mindful that those things are limited and that we're supposed to steward them well, not be wasteful. Worship God only. Yeah, like we talked about last week. You don't worship creation. We steward creation as a way to worship God. Yeah, yep. We get them out of order sometimes, yep. Any other thoughts on that? All right, shall we move to chapter 2? We're finally going to make it to chapter 2. I'm going to just skip over the first few verses about Sabbath because we did talk about that in pretty good detail last week with Heather. If you missed last week, Is the video up, Kayla? On YouTube, you can always go watch. If you missed a week, go back and watch it. So in verse 4, we have that phrase, well, my Bible says, these are the generations. Does anybody else have something different? This is the account of. So Heather mentioned in the first week, whenever we see this, we know that we're entering into a new section of the narrative. These are the generations of. It's like saying, this is the account of. But was that confusing to anyone that we are entering a new section of the text, but then the account is more creation?
Yeah, I did before when I read this one, wait a minute.
Yeah. Yeah. It feels like, wait, we just talked about this, how he created the man and woman. It's like we're zooming in now on that part, on that day. It's not out of order. It's not that now he circled back and is doing some more over here with humanity. It's that humans are the creature that were the crowning part of creation. This is the part of creation that God stamped his imago Dei on, his image, and he wants us to know a little bit more about what happened with creation. So he gives us some more details. So this is zooming in on that part of the text. This chapter is less repetitive and it's more intimate. And so I want you guys to discuss at your tables. You flip the page to day 2 in your homework. Questions 14 and 15. So 14 says, does God seem more personal in Genesis 2? Which of his words or actions lead you to that conclusion? And then, is it easier for you to conceive of God as almighty or as personal? So discuss those 2 questions. I'll give you 5 minutes or so to discuss those at your tables. Okay, so what were some of your answers of how you saw God be more intimate and more personal in this section, or in chapter 2?
We were just talking about trees, and I was talking about, I'm older, I can look back on my life and see how personally God was to me, how he loved me so much that he took care of things at a time when I didn't even know was going to happen.
Your personal experience proves it. Yeah. What words or actions from chapter 2 drew you to the conclusion that God was more personal in this chapter?
God said to Adam that he wanted him to have a helper. And God spoke about what he was to do for him.
He's right there in it with him, taking care of his needs. Yeah. Yeah, that's good. Thank you. Did you have something else to add? No, okay. He breathes life into Adam. How close do you have to be to someone? It doesn't get much more, personal than that. What else? Oh, yeah. Yes. Yeah, that little shift in the way the name that was used for God, that wasn't Moses being whoops, I forgot, that was intentional to show us the personal aspect. Because we see in chapter 1 that God is this transcendent creator over everything. He's outside of time. He's omniscient and omnipotent, and he can speak, and the whole world is created. But then he also is personal, and he can breathe life into something. And that is, they feel like they're not the same. They're very different qualities, but so we can hold them both in tension because he is both. We see it in just these first 2 chapters of the Bible. Okay, so the next section, let's turn the page. And I want to go through this just kind of a few verses at a time. In this section, In the book, we're on page 60. Although I don't know that we're going to cover too much in the book. So I just want to go through this next section, a few verses at a time, and talk about it because we get a little more idea here what's going on with Adam, what's going on in the garden, what the garden looks like. So we're just going to take it a few verses at a time and cover it. So someone at this table over here, could you read verses 5 and 6 for us? Okay, thank you. So this is a little bit of detail about what it was like in the time. There hadn't been rain yet. There was some sort of internal watering system coming up to water the plants, which makes it make more sense of why the people thought Noah was crazy when he said it was going to rain, because there was not rain. And so we'll get to that in a couple of weeks. But that's an interesting fact to tuck away for later. Someone at this table, could you read verse 7? So we see that intimacy that we just talked about, of God breathing life. He forms man and breathes life into him. And then someone at this table, could you read verses 8 and 9 at Ashley's table?
The Lord God planted a garden toward the east in Eden, and there he placed the man whom he had formed. Out of the ground the Lord caused to grow every tree that is pleasing to the sight and good for food.
So now we're zooming in a little bit on the garden, and we see what the garden has there as part of it. So garden means protected area, and Eden means delight. So this was a protected area of delight. How wonderful does that sound? And you've got to think Moses is telling this to the Israelites who have been wandering around in the desert. Can you imagine the longing they would have felt for a place like this? They have no plants, no water. God's feeding them the same thing every day. They're sustained, but they don't have this lush garden. So the impact of how that would have felt, it's hard for us to imagine how much they would have been longing for that. And then we get some information about what's growing there. We have every tree that's pleasant to sight and good to eat. And we have the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which, not to spoil anything, but that's going to be a real main player next week as Heather teaches on the fall. So the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil are in the middle of the garden. The tree of life demonstrates that God is sovereign over life. He has the ability to give life as he chooses. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil is representative of all knowledge, all moral knowledge, which is appropriate only for God, because as we talked about a few minutes ago, God created everything, and he immediately and effortlessly knows everything about everything, and he gets to define it because he designed it. So this knowledge of the tree of good and evil is representative of the fact that God holds all moral knowledge, and he determines morality. So God designs it, God defines it. We'll talk more about that tree next week. But God alone is omniscient over that. All right, someone from Brooks' table, could you read verses 10 through 14? Thank you. No, you're good. So we get all this specific information about these rivers, and I bet you weren't thinking, I know exactly where that was. And I think that what Jen was getting at in the homework, or Buddy, when she says which of these is familiar and which things aren't, I think what she's getting at is that the Israelites would have known this, that they would have heard these descriptions in been like, oh yeah, in the east, just over there, that's where it was. I think I maybe disagree with Jen here, but I think it's more likely that the landscape and the whole topography was changed during the flood, which would have happened between Eden and when Moses is writing this to the Israelites. At the end of the day, nobody knows for sure, so it's fun to think about. It's fun to think about, but not get hung up on, is what I meant to say. If you remember back to your, middle school history days, or if you're a homeschool mom and got to teach this again to your kid, the Fertile Crescent was the area between the Euphrates and the Tigris River. There are rivers named that today still, and that area around there is very lush, and very green, and fertile. But it's also, so that's that would be what is present-day Iraq, in and around there. However, it's also very possible that these rivers were named after the original rivers that no longer exist in the same place, kind of like we have Peru, Indiana, named after Peru, the country. That's not the original Peru. They didn't name the country after Peru, Indiana. I'm not sure. You can fact check me. I'm pretty sure. Or there's Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, named after Bethlehem, the little town that we know of. So it's also very possible that this area, that these rivers that we know of from school were named after those initial rivers. We can't really know for sure. I think that's what she was getting at, that the Israelites, as Moses is telling them this, would have been like, oh yeah, it was right over there. But we don't really know. So I don't know if I would tell Jen that in person, but I'm not sure that I agree with her on that. Okay, and then I will read verses 15 to 17. And the Lord God took man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and keep it. And the Lord commanded the man, saying, you may surely eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. For in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die. So he puts Adam in the garden to work it, to start to fulfill that creation mandate where he's having dominion over the whole creation. And he gives him this one restriction, which we know a lot of us have kids or have babysat or whatever, that when you give a restriction, it's for the child's good. I always tell my kids, I'm not trying to ruin your fun. I'm trying to keep you alive. Work with me here, Millie. It's always Millie. It's never Finn that's trying to die. But the restrictions are for their good. And so, again, we'll talk about that more next week. I don't want to step on Heather's toes as she teaches that next week. All right, so then moving on to any questions about any of that? I covered that kind of quickly because I want to keep moving on to the next section. Any thoughts? Okay, so then on day 4, we look more closely at verses 18 to 25. Could I get one more brave volunteer to read that section? Thank you. So last week we saw how God declares everything good as he's creating it. And then what is said in verse 18 that's kind of jarring after that? Yeah. He says it's not good. And that feels like, well, wait a second, he's omniscient and he knows everything and he's the creator, and why is this not good? This isn't a situation that God didn't foresee. This is that God has waited to meet this need that needs to be met for Adam. There is some sort of an implication of like a passing of time between when Adam is created and when Eve is created. I don't know, how long of a time that is. But there is some things that happen between Adam and Eve being created. So no one knows if that was, a couple of hours or what. I'm not going to get into the specifics because I'm not a theologian and I can't speak on all of that. But there's some sort of implication of a passing of time between when Adam is created and when Eve is created. And man's solitary existence is the only thing that's called not good, and it's declared by God himself. So before God, though, creates Eve, we have this little animal parade, which is a game I used to play with Millie, where we'd line up all of her animals and it kept her busy. But it's like, picture Adam standing here, and all the animals are going past him, and as they're going past, and we don't know how specific he was getting on names. I think he was naming canine. Nope, that one's not like me. Equine. Nope, that one's not like me. As the animals were going by, he's naming these classes of animals or naming the specific animals. And with each passing animal, it's becoming more and more apparent that he is alone. He doesn't have anyone who's the same as him. And this has got to be getting more and more discouraging as it goes along, because each animal, not like me. Oh, that one's cute. That's got a long neck and spots. That's not like me, though. And everyone that's going by, this tension is building that there's something Adam is missing, because none of them are like him. And God's statement that it's not good is referring to him needing a relationship, and it's impossible to have a relationship alone because none of these animals are like him. But then God puts him into this sleep, and he wakes up and he sees Eve, and the first thing he says is, "That's like me." Bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh, she's like me. And that need that he had was perfectly fulfilled in woman by God. And we see that intimacy again. Eve is made from the same thing as Adam, and God breathes life into her, and it's this intimate creation. And he stamps woman also with his imago Dei, that he made them male and female. And this is the crowning moment of creation when humans are created and God stamps his image on them. Again, God values the man and the woman equally, and we're going to look into that a little bit more in the second half of class. Then we end chapter 2 with the very first marriage. It says, "Therefore, a man shall leave his mother and his father and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." Again, God designed it. God defines it. It's kind of like our theme today, I guess. God designs marriage to be between one man and one woman. Marriage, this relationship, is necessary for part of that creative mandate to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, which requires a female and a male to reproduce. Again, this is not what our culture teaches us anymore, that marriage is between a man and a woman, but God designed marriage. God gets to define marriage, and we submit to that as he calls us to it in Scripture. They become one flesh. This is not just physically, but they become emotionally one flesh, spiritually one flesh. They're in union in everything. And something, Susie, I think it was you said how together man and woman image God. And I feel like something to think about also is in our culture we talk about all of these differences between man and woman, and sometimes men and women are just pitted against each other. And we need both to work together to image God well. We have so much in common as well as our differences, but but man and woman together become one flesh to image God to the world. It's not us against them, which it sometimes feels like in our culture today. And this one fleshness is meant to be in the context of marriage between a man and a wife. Whew. Okay, so God designs it, God defines it with gender, with marriage, with morality. God defines it for us. Any other questions or thoughts or comments on this section? We covered a lot really fast because we're going to do a kind of longer activity in the second half of class. I know, I'd never dwelt on that before because it goes so fast. It's like, I'll make him a helper fit for him. Oh, let's name some animals real quick. And there she is. It's really, it's not a long narrative. And so we see it as boom, boom, boom. There wasn't any time for Adam to even notice he was lonely. But I think that the implication is that he did notice, none of this is like me. Now, how actual lonely he felt because they're in paradise, I don't know, how his emotions really were, but there is this implication that Adam was realizing that none of these things were like him. Yeah.
The intentionality of God, like you said, to
Perfectly meeting that need.
To him.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, it had to be as intentional along, right? If he's
Yeah.
thinking, be fruitful and multiply.
Yeah. He knew that he was going to make, yeah, right. Exactly.
He told them to get male and female animals,
Right.
so there was a reason for that.
Yep. And Adam's, I'm sure, noticing that as they're parading by him. Well, he has a friend. Well, they have a friend. They have a partner, and he didn't have a partner. But yes, this wasn't an oversight by God where he's like, ooh, I forgot how is man going to multiply, because there's no, this wasn't an oversight. But I think it was more of the intention of Adam to see that God meets his needs perfectly in woman. But then, like you were saying, Cheryl, it proves that God meets our needs, that he's personal. And this was one of the first ways that God showed that to Adam. I've got you. I've got this all under control. Here's exactly what you need. And very personal, very intentional. Yeah, it kind of gives me chills to think about, because it's not a section that we usually slow down and really think through what that would have been like. All right, let's have a break. We'll start back up at 10:40. Okay. Let's come back together after the break here. So we talked about how God created us male and female, and how both genders have the same value, and how both genders reflect God to the world. So I want us to dig into that a little bit deeper, because it is women's Bible study. Let's look at woman. Let's look back at Genesis 2, verse 18 and 20. What word in both of those verses does God use to describe woman? A helper. That's right. The Hebrew word for helper in both of these verses is the word azer. So we're going to do a little study, a little word study, a little more info on the word azer at our table. So the worksheet is front and back. Some of these are more just to discuss. You can write down, your thoughts. I left room for that. But this is to discuss at the table and kind of work through as a group, stop and discuss things as they come up, and then we'll come back together. I'm going to give you a good amount of time, maybe 20 or so minutes to work through this, because there's quite a few questions, and I want you to have good discussions as you go. And then we'll come back together and wrap up together. All right, let's come back together and discuss this a little bit as a group. So I hope you guys have a better understanding of the word azer after doing that little azer, whatever. Azer. I looked it up. because I knew I was going to be saying it a lot. The word azer is used 21 times in the Old Testament in Hebrew, 2 times to refer to woman in Genesis 2. A couple of times it's referred to in like a military way, like a helper in a battle. All the rest of the times it refers to God, which you guys found out in your worksheet. So this is not a weak word. I feel like, I'm sure you guys talked about this at your tables, and some of us are in different generations where this kind of like stereotype of what a Christian woman is probably perceived differently for each of us. But I think often in our culture, this helper word is almost diminished or feels less than. And that's just not the case here. This isn't some subordinate or subservient. I mean, we would never look at God as an azer and say that he is subservient or less than. And so I think we can understand that woman as azer is not less than man. But we image God in different ways. So looking at number 10 on the worksheet, how does understanding God as our azer change the way you view woman as an azer? Did it change as you went through the worksheet? I know. I built the tension before you got to the explanation. That's right. And this, the azer kenegdo is the only, or kenegdao, I don't actually know how to pronounce that. That's the only place those 2 Hebrew words are together. The fit helper is to refer to woman. Did you have something more? I'm sorry, I kind of talked over you. Mm-hmm.
When you really break it down to like, what is God saying? Not like
Right.
what is everything else saying. What is God saying? And those words like stood out to me a lot.
Because start to finish, the Bible speaks very highly of women. It was countercultural all the way through. Like I remember, I don't know, whenever we studied Luke, which was a while ago, I taught on a chapter, I think it's Luke 8. And there's a lot of women and how the way Jesus treated women and uplifted women and cared for women was so countercultural. I mean, from start to finish, women are not less than in God's eyes. But people twist scripture, or just the culture doesn't abide by scripture, and so it comes out differently in different ways. Yeah. Exactly. Yes. Very important. Does the knowledge that you were created in the image of God, bearing and reflecting his attributes, change how you understand yourself as a woman? Is it kind of the same answer as 10, or did anyone have anything else to add? Yeah. And it's not saying, I don't think anyone went there. It's not saying that we are God or that we perfectly represent these attributes, but to use the same word for something that God does. That's huge. This is not weak. This is not invaluable. It is different than what he calls man to. And that leads us right into number 12. What are some ways that you guys discussed that women uniquely image God? Mm-hmm. And of course, men can share compassion and love as well, but women tend to be more nurturing. often. None of this is universal across the board. Of course, men can be compassionate and nurturing as well, but women tend to be more naturally nurturing.
We can give life.
Can give life. Yep. Women tend to be more relational. Like we see here in Genesis that humans were created to live in relationship. Like Adam needed Eve to have relationship, and women tend to kind of spur that on more than men. Women are more relational, more chatty, all of these things. This is not a weakness. This is what we were created to be, is relational. Any other thoughts? Say that again. Yes. Yes, absolutely. She said we do those through God. He's given them to us. Yeah. Anything else? I hope this was helpful and will kind of change the way you see that that passage or your calling as a woman. Your value is not first in what you do, but in who you image. So we image God in this way. So no matter what you wanted to be when you grew up, no matter what you actually grew up to be, if you're fulfilling those roles or not, you image God as an Azer, no matter what role you're in. This is part of who you are, woven into the fabric of your being. It's not dependent on being a wife or being a mother or being a nurse or whatever you thought you would be. This is part of who you are as you image God, regardless of what your roles are. And I think that's really cool. All right, so then...
Downgrade the part of a woman, job and motherhood and
Mm-hmm.
marriage and the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
Womanhood, it's something that he's anti-God.
Yes.
He totally downgrades all that and tries to make us feel that we're not important.
Mm-hmm.
We know, like you said.
Yeah. I think that that's a really good point, that these things are diminished to make us feel them less than when we really aren't, but that's Satan at work in the culture making us feel that way. And we have value and worth directly from God, and he's called us uniquely to be as there to the world. So, all right.
Kind of gives you the right purpose, too.
Yeah.
My purpose isn't, based on my career or blah, blah, blah. It's based on my image that was created by him.
It gives you your identity.
Yeah, exactly.
My identity is not in the tasks that I do, or
Mm-hmm.
it's in who I was created. That reflection of God.
Yeah. And you can reflect that in whatever role he's put you in, whether that looks like what you expected or not. Yeah, for sure. Any other thoughts? Thanks for sticking with that. I know that was a long assignment, but I felt like it built as you went and helped really drive the point home. So at your tables then, I want you to have some time to pray, but as you're praying, I'd like you to talk about, on page 64, the wrap-up question, that knowing God is blank shows me that I am blank. So how did you fill that in? Or maybe you would change it now after class, after we've discussed the things in more detail, but discuss that as you share your prayer requests as well.